Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Logos to do an after-action report on the Academic Agent Cigar Stream 122, where Academic Agent, Charlemagne, and Clossington debate Sargon on the justifications for liberalism. Now, this was partly a follow-up to an earlier cigar stream where he talked about James Lindsay, and his kerfuffle with Aaron McIntyre. That's not directly pertinent to this, but that was sort of the backstory. Because apparently Sargon weighed in and thought, well, hey, wait a minute. Liberalism, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So he was invited on to give his defense. Now, we're going to break this up into, broadly speaking, 4 parts of analysis. The first part is legitimating political myths, which hinges around this disagreement between the divine right of kings legitimating myth and liberal democracy. The second part will be memes and morals. Give me an account of your memes or your underlying justification for political beliefs with the implicit basis of rejection on Moore's open question. And then we have conspicuous by its absence, why the left is in power and how they use internal critique. And the fourth part will be the rule of technocracy and why none of these things can change unless it fails. But to sort of set this up as a sort of preamble or introduction, Sargon accuses the NRX crowd, but specifically Academic Agent, that his group of guys are too theoretical. They speak in these broad, abstract terms that can't really reach out to the normies, which is extremely ironic given that when he debated Richard Spencer said that his liberalism was too abstract and too difficult for the normies to grasp. But what we see, though, is that Sargon's overall objections throughout this entire debate are going to be, in some sense, colored and conditioned by this strive to be practical and not too theoretical, because if it's too theoretical, then you lose the normies. So what are your sort of thoughts on that first opening part there?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. One of the very first things I thought of when I saw Sargon accuse him of that is exactly what Richard Spencer said to Sargon. I mean, let's be honest, it is kind of easy to look at some of the NRX stuff and say, wow, that's like really, really, deep and theoretical, and maybe even overthinking some things to a degree. But I mean, let's look at the alternative in Sargon's case, liberalism. So you have this really, really interesting model where here's where it gets really interesting, right? So some people kill and commit genocide on some other people and take their land. And after that's done, we can start doing fair market transactions on the taken land, and you get this idea of cascading property rights through generations and transactions. So we have this noble lie that's based on the primacy of property rights. However, it's based on a founding that has to acknowledge that basically all property that a civilization has usually is taken through forced genocide and so on. And so however theoretical way you cut that knot to legitimize the current system is going to have to be abstract and really, really difficult for normal people to understand, because on the face of it, it does seem kind of like contradictory. Property rights are property rights until, somebody wins and takes us over, and then they're not. So I think Sargon has himself around the noose he tied for the other people, basically.
Exactly. So there's a lot of the debate revolved around discussions and arguments about elite theory, which I think was largely not constructive, in large part because Sargon repeatedly said that he agreed with the articulation of the elite theorists, at one point even telling Academic Agent, yeah, this is self-evident. I'm not questioning any of this. So I think the important disagreement that develops, that then sort of colors and shapes the flow of the rest of this debate, is the founding myths or the legitimating principles of these political ideologies. And there's really 2 that Academic Agent singles out. One is the sort of divine right of kings, or Charlemagne, I rule by the right of God. And then liberal democracy, which is the idea that the people are sovereign. Now, Academic Agent wants to make the claim that the claim about the divine right of kings is either, unprovable or indeterminate, which, has its own set of limitations, but that's better and different from being demonstrably false, because the political legitimating principle of liberal democracy is demonstrably false, such that, we can't actually believe it. And so he's making the claim that, well, an indeterminate claim or a unprovable claim is better than one that's demonstrably false. Sargon then responds by saying, well, no, all of these political claims are equally false. He also makes a claim related to that when you have this elite theory description that academic agent is giving, it's based on a set of assumptions and preconditions and all these loaded sort of underlying infrastructure, if you will, the warp and woof of this argument. But that's the same true for any political ideology, including liberalism. So it's unclear if Sargon is using this as a argument against academic agent, which just is kind of a genetic fallacy. I mean, unless he's trying to point out, make implicit assumptions explicit. But then that would be true of him as well. That's not really an argument for or against the position. It's just an argument. It's just saying that, well, there are these other underlying principles, and maybe I agree with them, and maybe I don't. But I think what Sargon, when he says that all these political principles, underlying narratives, are equally false, I think that that's actually a lot harder for. He doesn't actually prove it, and I think it's a position that is difficult to hold to because, again, there are some legitimate principles that are demonstrably false, and there are some that are indeterminate. So they are different in their nature, and so you could have a spectrum. One can imagine a spectrum of underlying politically legitimating philosophies, ranging from true propositions all the way to false propositions, with everything in between. And I don't see any preconditions that would necessitate it one way or the other. So if Sargon is going to insist on that, and he's going to criticize academic agent for saying, well, you have all this, underlying baggage you have to front load. Well, please, Sargon, front load why all political philosophies have to be based on lies. He hasn't done that to my knowledge. Logos.
Yes, the two things that you're pointing out here are Sargon's accusation of being ideological, and then also his other equivocation on the falsity of axioms. So to the first point, Sargon isn't really giving an argument against academic agent because he is ideological. That would be silly. Sargon actually admits that everybody is ideological, and that's not his problem. This circles back to Sargon's previous point that the way in which academic agents' theories are ideological are too tough for the normies. And this is kind of a problem that academic agent created for himself. Because instead of biting the bullet on like the NRX stuff he's going through being kind of complicated, what he does when Sargon accuses him of being like ideologically confusing, he says, well, I'm not ideological at all. It's all descriptive, man. But you can't do that, right? Because this gets to Hume's famous is-ought gap. Like Sargon agreed with everything academic agent said about elite theory, like as you said, like he agreed to all of it. That wasn't the thing here. The question is, what do you do with the fact that elite theory is true? And that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where you get ideology. That's where you get political oughts. And that's what Sargon's talking about, is the way they're constructing their political oughts are too complicated for normies to understand. And he means it in the Alinskyite view of complicated, right? Where you need good slogans, basically. Sargon's entire political philosophy is you can change society if you get enough people who are, your average folk who don't care too much about this stuff to band with you and force change. That seems to be Sargon's implicit view of how society runs. And so if your political ideologies are too complicated to put on a placard, so people can wave signs around with them, then it's just not going to happen. Like nobody is going to take an entire page out of Mencius Moldbug or something and put it on a sign and wave it at a protest and hope that people can read it. No, you have to have quick, snappy slogans, which he highlighted later. So it's not that they were ideological that's the problem. It's the way in which they were. And AA kind of derailed the whole thing by trying to say they weren't ideological in the first place. Well, you have to be, because no amount of descriptive true facts gets you to what you ought to do about them. That's just fact. For the other thing that we talked about, so you talked about the ideology, and you talked about
the truth or falsehood of the underlying political claims.
Right. So this gets to Moore's open question. So to review for people, Moore's open question is basically something like this. Let's suppose, so it's actually a refutation of moral naturalism, the idea that let's suppose that some oughts reveal themselves to us in nature, right? We study nature and we just discover an ought somewhere. We can always ask the question non-trivially, well, ought I adhere to what nature seems to show me this ought is, right? If you just like handed an ought on a silver platter descriptively from nature or something, you can always ask, ought I follow what nature seems to be showing me this ought is? And you can always answer no. Now, you can also generalize this to theistic morality. So let's suppose God gives you some morality on like a tablet or something. Well, this is what God says you have to do, but ought I follow what God says? Well, trivially, non-trivially, people say yes or no, because, people rebel against God all the time, even in the Bible. So the existence of oughts, no matter where they come from, aren't enough to guarantee that we ought to comply with them. And so that seems to be the way that Sargon, that's the only way Sargon can show that all these things are false at the same time in the same way. What Academic Agent is saying is, well, we have some things that are descriptively false here in liberal democracy land, right? It is descriptively true that the will of the people determine blah, 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 but it's just descriptively false that. But what Sargon's saying is, I don't care what's descriptively true or false, because implicitly he has in his head the idea that even if there were descriptive truths and falsities by which you build a political framework on, that is not enough. That's not enough to tread the gap of Moore's open question. You need more than that to get to whether you ought to follow them anyway. So I think Sargon might even have in his head the idea that you could have a whole bunch of descriptive statements that are absolutely false, like completely false, and people will still follow and believe them anyway. And of course, the example he might give given the debate is, the comment he made about his son, right? He doesn't want his son to be altered. Let's put it that way. He has something more colorful. I won't repeat it on stream, but the idea is people are believing a whole bunch of absolute falsehoods in his view about sex and gender or something, and he doesn't want to follow them, but people do want to follow them, and that's why he's worried. So the truth or falsity of descriptive facts isn't enough to ensure that people act in sane manners, basically. And so it's not enough to make sure they act in not insane manners either. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, the other related underlying concept here is that Sargon seems to be a consequentialist, because while admitting that all of these underlying legitimating principles are equally false, again, he hasn't proven that or demonstrated that, but that's where he's coming from. There's this sort of side digression about, China and political rights and the West. And he's like, well, look, liberal democracies, even though we can't prove them in this particular kind of way that I'm actually demanding that you prove NRX, it has better outcomes. You can't get arrested by secret police in the night. You can criticize public officials and not worry about your career being ruined. Now, he would then say that, well, what's happening now is a hostile takeover of liberal democracy. Academic Agent would say, well, no, that's just the end state of liberal democracy. But what it seems to me is that Sargon's political theory is a kind of consequentialism, where we should judge these political theories not on the truth of their legitimating moral principles, but on the good or desired outcomes that they produce. But yeah, so we'll start with that.
I actually don't know if I agree with that completely. I think his moral theory is actually more of a bouye ethics as far as his moral theory goes, because the overlying point he's trying to make here is, look, if you're trying to give an example about how democracy is going to be tough and stop like meddling from the World Economic Forum or something, and people say, okay, so what's an example of how this can work? And you show them China, they'll be horrified. So it's not a matter of like what the consequence is. It's a matter of you can't use people like China, Russia, and stuff like that to convince normies to change, because a lot of normies just aren't going to want to be Russia and China. And so it's a matter of boo Russia, boo China. You're not convincing normies more or less so than it is some robust consequential system.
Right. Now, basically what Sargon does, and this will sort of telescope out and then go back into particular points. So he's saying that, well, when they were talking about the divine right of kings, he's like, well, I just don't believe the claims made about Charlemagne or any other king. And he says, I'm just free to not believe that. And then he's like, and then Academic Agent is like, well, but then what's your objection then? Because on the one hand, you want us to give a justification for these foundational beliefs, but then you say they can't be given because they're all false. But then at the end, Sargon says, well, what you really guys need to do is find a way to convince other people of the truth of your highly abstract theories. But here's the thing, right? First of all, if none of these underlying principles are actually true in any meaningful sense, what is there to convince them of? This isn't like a logical proposition where you go from premise to premise to conclusion, because there's no truth to be found there in an absolute sense. And then second of all, the leftist is tapping Sargon on the shoulder and saying, hey, remember how you just freely rejected all of these, underlying principles because you just aren't convinced, bro? Well, neither am I. I'm not convinced of any of your liberal propositions. So on the same grounds, I'm just going to reject all of your liberal propositions. And again, I get the feeling that Sargon is, sort of tightening the noose around his own neck. Logo.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of the most frustrating things I found when watching the debate is Sargon had a good moment of clarity in the beginning when he said, all these things may be false, and it just seemed like he was alluding to Moore's open question here. But then he completely lost me when he said, "You need to find a meme that like appeals to the normies. That they can a positive vision that they can look on and say, yeah, that's true." And in fact, he said that argument is self-evidently true. But if what he was saying is right, there are no self-evidently true arguments. There are arguments that you choose to believe, and there are arguments that you choose to discard. Divine right of kings isn't self-evident. The theory of property rights is not self-evident, given that it's founded on the contradiction of genocide before the conquering emperor gets to distribute the property. Um, None of this is self-evident. It's all open to interpretation, special pleading, and all the rest of it. But even then, even if you navigate all of that, you smooth it over so people can package it and understand it, they can still reject it. Your example of leftists rejecting liberalism is perfectly right. Even if they get all the property right stuff straightened out, leftists can look at their lot in life and how the system is treating them compared to other people and say, this property rights thing, maybe it's an internally consistent system, but my life sucks because of it. And I think my life ought to be better than it is. And therefore, I ought to reject this property rights thing that I think is holding me down. And so it just seems to me that whatever positive proposition you come up with, whatever one, let's just take Sargon's initial argument to its conclusion. Whatever one you come up with will never be self-evidently true and can always be gainsaid by normies. So the real question here, which we're going to talk about later, is what determines whether things are okay to be gainsaid or not. And it seems like it's out of the control of the person making the political claim.
Right. One other element that I just thought of, because we talked about this last night with the Theaetetus, is it possible that Sargon is sort of making a sort of Rortian consequentialism where it's like you need the memes to just play these word games to convince enough people to agree with you based on the subjective reason that you just don't like, the alternative system being rolled out. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and that's why I said that I don't think his ethics is consequentialist. I think it's bouye, because the question is, what can you convince the normies to do with you? And it's not that China is consequentially bad in some measurable system. I mean, Sargon might not even know like which axis of the greater good or whatnot that he'd be measuring China and Russia by. He would just say, I don't like it, and most people probably don't like that, and so we're just not going to use that as a strategy. That's stupid. And so I think that's exactly what he's doing.
Right. And now we can kind of get to what I call conspicuous by its absence. So the sort of elephant in the room throughout this entire debate is the left is in power. Neither side likes that it's in power, or more specifically, the woke left. Sargon is maybe an earlier iteration of a liberal left. AA and Charlie are clearly anti-left wing in all of its forms. But that's sort of like it's there now, right? Now, it's interesting, right? This whole discussion about elite theory and how you get power and how you stay in power. But the elephant in the room is they don't talk about how the left got in power and stays in power. And the way they do it is the people that were in power, say in the 50s and 60s, they took advantage of certain moral beliefs that they had through the use of internal critique and then pitted them against each other in order to create this dialectical process that would lead to those people then coming to the synthesis of a more or less left-wing progressive shift in the Overton window. And so when you ask these leftists to then justify their own positions on their own terms, they usually can't. So the way that they are able to move society in their direction is by playing this Hegelian dialectical process with the beliefs that other people already have. Now, the other thing they'll do along with that is they'll subrupt it. So if you look at like modern day progressivism, they've learned that instead of attacking Christianity head on, like USSR style, you use all of the Christian language in vernacular, but then you impute it with radically unchristian meanings. And then so it takes a very subtle reader to see what these people are actually saying and teaching, because they'll use words like resurrection and sanctification and all these Christian lingo, but it means something totally different. And so this act of subruption is also how they fulfill this Hegelian dialectic as well. So logos.
Yeah, and this is one of the other frustrating things in the second half of the debate that I was listening to is Sargon is reading Alinsky, which is good, but I don't think he's paying attention to the historical context under which Alinskyite tactics were able to work. And Sargon actually lays out exactly how it worked, but he doesn't he doesn't flip it to the current day to see why it won't work again. So what happens is the left wants these things, and politicians say no, 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 no. But the left flips these arguments on politicians about morality, and they use the politicians' own moral compasses against them to turn those no's into yeses. It's exactly what Sargon said. Now, the problem is, once the left take power and the left get enough of these politicians, right? This is where you get the Hitchens two-step, okay? The Hitchens two-step, for people who aren't clear of apologetics, is Christopher Hitchens is just one example of somebody who will say something like, there are no objective morals, there's no fact of the matter, moral is just like whatever you want it to be, bro. And then when talking about the Bible, well, God, the Bible is just this mean, terrible, like bully, terrible, terrible person. It's like, well, okay, by what objective standard are you rating God to be like this terrible, terrible person? And the best that Hitchens and a lot of other atheists will come up with is, oh, well, yours, it's internal critique, bro, right? Now, that two-step goes from the subjective claim to the, acting as if objective claim. But suppose you flipped it in reverse. Suppose you have these politicians that get into power and get this legislation pushed by pretending they have some moral compass or moral standard. But then suppose you try to use Alinskyite tactics on these politicians to turn their no's into yeses or yeses to no's or vice versa. And you find out they actually don't have a moral compass. They're just playing around. And so you're not actually going to flip them based on like what's in their head. It's not going to happen because they actually know their morals or lack thereof, or whatever you want to say. They already know what they believe. They already know what their foundations are. They already know that morality is subjective, and so they're just going to try to use power to make reality the way they want it to be. And so they're not like these earlier generation normie politicians that could have been flipped. Now, what Sargon could be alluding to is the neutral politicians, the well-meaning, just I'm going to run for city council types that aren't really politically active. That's one way he could be talking about this. The problem with that is, if you look at the political trends, we're getting more and more politically fragmented every single year. There's less and less, or fewer and fewer normally politicians to pick from to play that game. Whereas earlier on, I think a lot of people just wanted to care about tax rates and infrastructure and policy and stuff. They weren't really too interested in all these like moral philosophies about how society ought to run. Nowadays, that's not happening. If you look at the overlap and the splitting, there's fewer people like that to prey upon to switch things over and get votes. People are picking a side. They're either firmly like, no, here's where I am, here's where I'm going to be, or they're shifting radically leftward as the trends keep doing. And so, like, my question for that is, if that's Sargon's Alinskyite tactic, like, who's his target audience going to be in, let's say, 5 years if this fragmentation keeps going? I mean, who is going to be the target of his, making positive moral arguments? Even supposing he can, which via our previous conversation, Moore's open question, it's not even clear that he can do it, but suppose he can do it. By the time you get something figured out, if fragmentation happens and everybody's just explicitly picking a side, I mean, let's just suppose that the U.S. just keeps going the way it's going, and like the left just takes over the Senate, just takes over Congress or whatever. What are you going to do? You can't flip them Alinsky style because they know what they think and they don't think like you, and so you're done. So that's the frustrating thing that I thought.
Another element in this category, which is something that was not done by the reactionary side, was that so what makes the progressive takeover, say in like the beginning with the Obama years in the United States, and I guess that would be correspondingly in Britain as well, where Sargon lives. This use of pre-existing ideas, that are then through this internal critique of Hegelian dialectic to a new synthesis, came from liberalism. And I'm really surprised I didn't bring this out. So Noam Chomsky is famous for saying that, anarchism, progressivism, this whole gamut of radical left ideologies is the logical conclusion of the original liberal philosophers like John Locke, like Adam Smith. And now that's sort of an open. Now, what he means by that is in a sort of like intellectual sense. If you take these theories, these intellectual arguments all the way, and then you sort of, shed the baggage that they grew out of, which was, sort of Christian feudal England, then you'll realize that taken out, absent of any historical context, these theories and ideas will end up with something like anarchism or socialism or progressivism. And that makes, if that's true, and I think there is some justification for that, that makes liberalism ready-made to be hacked. And I'm actually really surprised that those on the right didn't bring that up. Logos.
Yeah, if only somebody would have asked Sargon that question a long time ago. Yeah, I wonder. I wonder how things would have gone if somebody had asked Sargon that question a long time ago. Anyway, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, a really good example of this would be like Locke's view of property rights. This idea that you can homestead property until property starts getting really, really scarce, right? Because once property starts getting really, really scarce, then people's homesteading of property precludes other people from having property. And so then your taking and use of property starts really, really affecting other people because you're not just taking your own little use of private property in the wilderness, and other people can get theirs. Now, if you flip that and apply it to today, well, what happens when you keep having, let's say, I don't know, mass immigration or something else, and you have all these people wanting to come in and build and rent out of rental properties, and you still have more people wanting to move in? Rents go up, right? So there is the sense in which, more people wanting to move into an area isn't just like some question of GDP and economic efficiency, but because a bunch of people moving into an area might make the living conditions in that area worse for the community that lives there, higher traffic times, higher rents, and so on. Um, Even Locke would say the community that already exists kind of has a say in what happens here. Well, if they have a say about that, what kind of a say do they get? Well, you could take like a far right position and say, well, we should curb immigration. You could take a far left position and say, no, 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 more people's fine. We're just going to like have rent control, right? That's the price. We can have more people in here and you'll rent out more units to them, but you're not going to jack up rents on top of that. So we'll have rent control. So that's even in like liberal thinkers like Locke, for crying out loud, that you can like have these discussions, but people treat like private property rights as if there's like this sanctified thing that you should never touch ever. But in these questions of uh, people's moving in and use of property affecting everybody else in the community, there's already precedent for this. And that's just one example. You could go on and find more and more and more. John Stuart Mill in Free Speech, for example. John Stuart Mill's famous for saying, like, well, I never would have killed Socrates, right? His essay on free speech. But then if you look at his actual textbook, not his textbook, his actual book on utilitarianism, if you go through every single criteria Mill lays out for his utilitarian ethics, you get to the end of that going, yeah, of course, Mill would have to kill Socrates, right? Because the Athenians experienced not having Socrates around, and they experienced times when Socrates was around, so they knew what it would be like without him. Mill never experienced either case, so Mill isn't informed, so he can't actually make a statement. The Athenians were informed. They knew of life with and without Socrates, and they would have wanted to kill Socrates. And so, like, if you look at all the things in Mill's utilitarianism, he couldn't actually gainsay it. And so this is another ready-made contradiction, right? So if we're going to go with some kind of like utilitarian ethics, this ends up devolving into some kind of collectivism. But this is one of like the biggest things about liberalism. It underpins neoclassical economics, for crying out loud, to some degree or another. You go to graduate level econ in a lot of institutions, and you're learning about aggregate utility functions that make up markets, economic efficiency being like, maximizing the utility to constraints and things like that. I mean, it's still everywhere in kind of like the neoliberal order when talking about economics. And so to the extent that you have all these problems with utilitarianism and so on, like it just happens. I mean, give me enough time, I can come up with as many examples and different topics as you want. Let's talk about the free press, for example, right? Oh man, it's so terrible that we have all these different news people basically treating people to several different realities about the way the world's going. Wouldn't it be great if people could talk to each other? Nah, shut your mouth. This is private property, man. We're talking about the free market. People can make whatever news station they want. They can spin facts however they want, and audiences are fundamentally rational human beings who can either accept or not accept what's on the news TV, and that's great. So again, all the time you see these different liberal principles against each other, and it's just super frustrating.
Right. And then the last part is the rule of technocracy. So this is a subset then of, okay, so we talked about how the left got to power. Now, how does the left stay in power? Well, they play this little magic trick with the myth of objectivity in science. So the technocracy is the rule by the technical elite. And so what the left will do, because they've already captured that institution, those set of institutions, universities, research centers, and the like, they can then publish journal articles and materials, pushing the Overton window in their direction. This was all sort of done covertly. And now when they're arguing with, say, an old school liberal, a conservative, somebody on the far right, a religious person, they can be like, well, look, let's go to this impartial third party, Mr. Science Man. Well, Mr. Science Man published these articles over here, which, obviously are impartial and based on statistical evidence and observation. And they just happen to point our way every single time. What do you know? And so if you object, they can say, well, you're anti-science. You're not even evil. You're just dumb and you're wrong. And the other thing is they can say, if you were to try to then argue, well, we have the repeatability problem of scientific papers. We have the idea that a lot of scientific papers are just false. I think it's like half of them. They can just wave that away. It's like, oh, well, that's something we can fix later, or that's a conspiracy theory or whatever. And as long as they can rely on this sort of like myth of objective neutrality of science, then they can cut the Gordian knot in their favor every single time.
Yeah, you want to talk about noble political lies? This is a pretty good one. Yeah, this is another thing that I wish would have been brought up in the debate, because let's suppose. So let me try to recap this a little bit for the audience, right? Because we've been talking about a lot of topics, and now we can kind of bring them all together. Noble lies are all necessarily false because of Moore's open question. You can always ask, well, ought I adhere to them? And the answer could always be no. So if you make memes based on the politics you're trying to push, those could always be false. So if Sargon wants positive memes for your position, anybody could accept or reject them. We have the problem of internal critique and the fact that you have the Alinskyite tactics worked because the left could be parasitic on a moral order that existed before them, but they don't have one underneath them. And so you're not going to get a repeat of Alinsky no matter if you follow his tactics perfectly. Now, let's put all that off to the side for a second. Let's suppose we could resolve all the moral issues, and by some absolute miracle, everybody in the conversation would agree on the same set of oughts. Good luck, but let's suppose we can get everybody to agree on the same set of oughts. In order to make sure that you're dictating policy that carries out the oughts that you all agree to, now we do have to resort to is facts. You can't get oughts from is, but you have to check to make sure your oughts are being carried out by looking at the facts to see if factually they are being carried out like we want them to. So eventually you're going to have to appeal to studies. And let's just cut right to the chase here. Good example of that. Sargon's worried about his son and school and trans stuff. Okay, well, the left has all these trans studies that say here's kids in pre-puberty struggling with gender. Here is the suicide rates. And so if you they have this thing where it's like, well, either you ought to think that we should avoid suicide or you're a monster. So, okay, we agree on the ought. We're going to avoid suicide if kids were necessary. And if we all agree on that, we have these studies that say, here's how you do it. Now, does Sargon have studies on the other side? No. Why not? Well, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons he may not ever be able to have studies on the other side. A, it takes grant funding to get studies. And what type of big organization are you going to get grant funding from that's going to go on record against basically this tide of this zeitgeist, basically? I mean, good luck. So good luck getting the funding for the studies. But even if you get the funding for the studies, they have to find a journal that's willing to publish the studies. So it has to survive a bunch of referee finagling and stuff like that. And when you submit an article to a journal, the refs could just say we don't like it because it's politically inconvenient. Now you could say, oh, that'll never happen. It could happen. It could totally happen, right? And even after articles get published in journals, they can be pulled. Look at the vaccine thing, Malone's article, right? Malone's article was just yanked from a journal without notice, without warning, without anything. That made big news because it was just inconvenient. That's something that's just about vaccines. Now imagine something as loaded as like gender and suicide rates in children and so on. Good luck. So even if you make it through all that stuff, if people notice your article, if it finally squeaks through, it could get yanked without warning. There's already precedent for it. So there's all sorts of systematic biases that the system has for the status quo of people who've kind of infiltrated academia. Well, how'd they infiltrate academia? Alinskyite tactics. How'd they use those tactics? Well, this gets back to the previous section. People had certain moral codes that were able to be hacked and get them in. Do you think we're going to get that a second time? No, because they know how they won. And so they know how they're going to defend against an assault just like theirs. So Sargon's like, we'll just do Alinsky again, guy. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. So in the moment, they have all the studies. And it's just as Todd said, if you try to gainsay any of these studies, you're just going to be and you won't even be morally wrong. you'll just be anti-science and stupid and not worth talking to, right? They could say, "Oh, you're not just morally mean, you're just dumb. You're just that dumb." "Oh, okay, you poor guy. Go learn to read and do stats and stuff like that, and maybe you can come to the grown-ups table," right? They can always do that. Um, so that's a thing. And okay, well, how dire is this problem? So me and Todd have talked privately about this, and we think the only way this gets fixed, so to speak, is if a cascade effect of things happens so bad that this is like USSR style collapse. It has to be apocalyptic failure, right? Because here is a thought experiment I put to people. Todd knows I love thought experiments. This is one of my favorite thought experiments to put to people about the technocracy problem. Let's suppose there's a possible world, not our world, right? Let's be clear. It's a possible alternate reality. Now, let's suppose in this alternate reality, things are a lot like they are here. We have the same university structure, journals, peer review, all this stuff. But let's suppose in this other world, not this one, this other world, let's suppose that the journals really are corrupt. There is a lot of politicization of grant funding. There is people with political agendas who are writing journals and just keeping articles from even getting through to get a proper hearing of peer review for like formal, here's the article, here's the refutation, and so on. They don't even see the light of day. Let's suppose that there are whistleblowers, but if they get caught, they basically get expelled from academia. And so they become, quote, fringe and conspiracy theorists, right? And so the system really is bad. And all the whistleblowers are teamed up on by the other academics and the media and called, fringe conspiracy theorists, right? So we have this world that's actually dire, that's actually terrible. My question to people is, how would we know if our world is that world? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, by what would we figure it out? We can't use studies in the universities because by assumption, the studies in the universities are corrupted in the other world. So they're corrupted and people just don't believe the whistleblowers in that world. So if we try to use a study in this world to say they're corrupted and they're whistleblowers, well, they could be just, fringe conspiracy theorists. That would just say our world is like that world and that nobody believes the whistleblowers. So we can't appeal to studies. So what would we use to say that our world is like that world? And nobody that defends the current system can give me a good answer to that question. Never has, never happened. So this pristine view of the academic institutions is an unfalsifiable, noble political lie. There's no way you can actually cut the knot unless it implodes so hard on itself that people have no choice but to believe it. And so that's basically my summary of how dire this is. Even if all the other obstacles are surmounted and we agree on odds, you can't bridge the gap as long as other people get to dictate what the objective science says about how to carry out the odds we agree with, because they're just controlling policy unilaterally and you're just a helpless bystander.
Well, what's absolutely very interesting about this, right? You mentioned donors and how they give money to people, and then they'll say what they'll publish and say what they're paid to publish and say. And now, how do these donors get very, very wealthy? Well, this is the accumulation of capital over generations using the liberal society that Sargon advocates. This liberal society, and now they are so powerful that they can just dictate to any institution, and anybody that disagrees with them is just out of luck. What are you going to do? I mean, they've amassed so much wealth over the generations. And then the people have themselves become so impoverished due to various social factors, which we don't need to get in here now, that they're really not able to push back. And so it's really, Sargon's been kind of hoisted up by his own petard, because the very liberalism that he advocates created a condition where there's a tipping point of super rich people that were using these property rights in their favor to then hijack the entire liberal system, because it's like, we don't believe that liberal system helps us anymore. To protect the capital that we already have and to grow more, we need a new system. And so then they then funded, these activists in the 60s and 70s. They then, fund these journals and do hostile. I mean, a classic example, textbook example of this is how Procter & Gamble in 1944 gave the American Heart Association it's like grant that got it started. So for the previous 20 years, the American Heart Association was literally just, a bunch of people on the fringe of society just, meeting and doing stuff. Procter & Gamble was a soap company that later eventually produced Crisco, which is a substitute for lard based on synthesizing seed oils. And then what do we know? All of a sudden, the American Heart Association says eating vegetable oil is good for your health. well, geez, let's see. Procter and Gamble pays them, gets them, this grant to become a nationwide household name, and they tell you to eat what Procter and Gamble makes. I mean, this is literally a textbook example of what happened, and it happened all over the United States, all over the Western world, but this is all done totally legally, totally within the parameters of classical liberalism. But now they're at a position where they can just chuck classical liberalism, turn the chairs over, and say, okay, now we're going to have a new system. What has been all called by various critics on the left and on the right kind of neo-feudalism, where there are these new feudal lords, these financial oligarchs, which then completely rule contrariance to classical liberal values. So that's kind of interesting how, on the one hand, but on the other hand, Sargon wants to make this distinction about, well, how do we continue to resist these people today? And he's claiming that at least one of two things, because academic agent and Charlie can't give an answer or don't yet have one, then their response is just, roll over and not fight. Because it was either academic agent or Charlie or both who said, well, right now they're just too strong to challenge directly, which is true. This is a waiting game. You have to build up your own support and then understand when the time is ripe to make a move. Sargon, again, as we've been discussing, is using the Alinskyite tactics, and he says that when he says resist the left now, he means resist it in that way. But that's not going to work because they already know how they got in power, and they're not going to let anybody else get in power the same way. So then there's this sense where Sargon isn't being honest with himself, where he's like, you don't actually have a path to translate your theory to the normies. Now, Charlie has said that we don't have that yet in Interacts. We're working on it. So at least there's a level of self-awareness there that Sargon doesn't have. And what I would say is the last part on this point here is then, okay, well, then how do we translate theory to practice? This isn't like a platonic dialogue where you just meet normies in the street and reasonably argue with them, because intelligences are not equally distributed. Not everybody can understand Hegel, and that's fine. Not everybody has to be able to understand the complexities of Hegel, but some people do. And then the way that you reach the normies is you say, well, look, the material and concerns that you have for material existence, the social concerns that you have for social existence, we provide a better system to meet those perceived needs. Now, you may not know how we derive that. We could show anybody who's competent to understand the line of arguments from axioms to application, but so we could show you if you wanted to or were competent to follow the process of argumentation. So we know what we're talking about, but we're talking about in such a way such that we are able to better provide for your material and social needs than whatever you're believing now. Logos.
Yeah, there's two things I wanna talk about this. First, you're absolutely right. We talked about this a little bit before stream, and yeah, show don't tell basically is going to be the key here. Where they seem to be arguing about this debate is about how to tell people, right? Academic agent had the whole like root them out or flesh them out or whatever his slogan was, and Sargon's like that'll never work because it's not positive. So they're arguing over different ways to tell people. But like, look, if what we said about technocracy is right, and you have a slogan that you're telling people, but these people have studies and the media and everything else thinking everything else is right, then your slogan telling people something is wrong is going to be counter to basically the entire weight of the current establishment. You have to show them that something is wrong, and you have to show them that you have an alternative. And so, yeah, nothing succeeds like success. You're going to have to build an alternative, basically parallel institutions that function in healthy ways, and people are just going to have to flock to those institutions naturally, even if they don't know why the institutions are working. But I guess that the main issue with that is, do you think that the current powers are going to let these parallel institutions work, especially if they have success? Probably not. And so this might be another thing where you just have to wait for power centers to start collapsing. once the power can't just amass a bunch of people and tear your stuff down if you build something that starts working, um, then you'll have a moment, because you can build something in that power vacuum, but before then you can always get torn apart, even if what you're building works, and then that could be an even worse blow to your movement than trying nothing at all, because people will know, right? People will know, well, we just can't do this thing, we're just powerless. They've been shown by the institutions how powerless they are, whereas the institutions haven't really explicitly shown that yet. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going. No, go ahead and finish your point.
Okay. So let's see. The other thing I was going to say was, we haven't talked much about academic agent in this debate, and that side. We talked a lot about Sargon and issues we found with Sargon. One thing I want to say about academic agent is, where I think he's right. I agree with Sargon that he doesn't have a positive view. But here's what I think, where I think academic agent in this side of the debate is actually like positively right, rather than Sargon being wrong, which is what we've been talking about so far. Going back to our discussion earlier about like things within liberalism giving the permissivity for these movements to hijack it, even deeper than that, right? Like Sargon thinks there's something wrong. He's worried about his son. Well, okay, so Sargon wants to make a slogan to get the normies, right? He's racking his brain trying to figure one out. Well, I mean, let's think about this. Let's reverse engineer one for a second. What Sargon is basically going to have to convince people of through a slogan is that the academic establishment, which is built on a hierarchy of competence, which takes the best of the best, should be apolitical, funded through everybody's tax dollars, is coming out with studies about how to protect children from harms that we all think are bad. And all these, and as a way of dealing with these harms, children that report certain things should be treated, according to some regimen. And he's afraid of that regimen hitting on his son. Well, in the words of somebody like Jack Angstrich, which premise do you deny, Sargon? Right? Whatever slogan you're going to put up is going to have to say minimally that something's wrong. It's going to have to minimally reject some step of that process all along the way to deal with what he's afraid of with his children. But any step along the way he objects to is going to gainsay one of his own tenets of, in my view, classical liberalism, right? Do we think that the institutions are not built on a hierarchy of competence? Oh, okay, that's interesting. What are they built on then? Are they built on some hierarchy of nepotism? Well, if anything, that seems to be, showing academic agent's point. Are they non-neutral institutions, even though they're funded by taxpayer dollars? That too would show academic agent's point, because the royals never claimed to be apolitical, and yet they take everyone's tax dollars all of the same. And so really you have a regime like that by another name. Whichever step of that process that Sargon wants to deny, whichever one, is going to run contrary to some assumption, the noble lie of classical liberalism. So this idea that he can defend it while coming up with this positive slogan that says something is wrong and it rejects some part of this process, that's going to be difficult. So let's give credit where credit's due to the people on the academic agent side of the debate. They know enough to know the consequences of saying something's wrong with the current system. And they know that whatever they critique is going to lead to a cascade of other effects that will undo every single assumption the current system is built on, and they've owned it. And so in that degree, I think they're far further along than Sargon currently is.
Yeah, and to that point, when I was on the Cigar stream to discuss libertarianism, that was, of course, academic agent's main critique of libertarianism. It's a kind of way to get people on the right to do nothing, because it's a kind of radical hyper-liberalism, which sort of ties your hands so that you can't do anything. And his claim that, I think he was reading like Mosca, and he said that, those quote unquote elected officials are not actually acting in the interests of those who voted for them. And he's writing in the late 19th century. So we're talking like, these industrial societies at this point. Clearly the technocrats, the technicians, they're not even elected, frankly, right? They're running in these institutions like universities and businesses. And they have, agents within the government that are, quote unquote, elected. And so that this kind of elite theory that they're acting not in the popular interest or not in the common interest, but in their own narrow private interests, does seem to be borne out by the big picture problem that you and I have just described. And the other thing too is this debate about drive them out versus a positive message. If it is the case that the Alinskyeites who've taken over don't have any values to internally critique, then it would seem that academic agent is right, because if you can't internal critique them out of their position, then the only thing you could do is drive them out.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to bring up earlier, right? Is if there's no foundational assumptions about their morality they can rest on, but if it look, they can talk a big game about diversity, equity, and inclusion or whatnot, but if all those are just words to help them achieve power, and you try to like wrestle them on those words in some way, they'll always fall back on, well, listen, man, it's not about intent, it's about outcomes. And we just want a society that generates these kinds of outcomes rather than those kinds of outcomes. So, whatever internal contradiction you think you've got us on, tough. Okay, fine. We'll eat the contradiction, but here's the outcomes we want. Now, do you want those or not, bigot? Right? And that's what it's always going to boil down to.
Right, right. And I think this is this okay. So I guess at a more essential underlying level, I think as far as needing a positive narrative and quote unquote driving them out, you can they're not necessarily antinomies, right? Because on the one hand, it depends on who you're trying to reach out to. One, right, is it the people in positions of authority, or is it the normies? Because if your goal is to replace what we have now with something else, you are going to have a positive vision of what that something else is, because people are going to want to, if no, the devil you know rather than the devil you don't know, right? It's like, yeah, they may not like the current system, but at least there's a certain level of familiarity and comfort with it that sort of keeps them involved. If you just say, well, come over here, and over here is this, room that's black with nothing in there, and you have no idea what's in there, you're like, no, that's scary. I'm not going to do that. But if you turn on the lights in that room and there's all of these conveniences and friends there, which is, this new position, this new world they can join, well, then now the choice becomes a lot easier, because now you can say, well, not only is it not scary, not only are you walking off a cliff with a cartoon character, you're actually going to get more than what the system gives you. And especially the system's death rattles, where it's going to try to crush these things. You're going to have to give at minimum more than the system for them to then do the cost benefit analysis of, well, the possible hardships that I incur by jumping ship versus the possible gains. For people to actually jump ship, they're going to have a higher level of probable gains to probable costs. And then the other thing is, though, if you're talking about the people in power and you can't actually have a moral argument with them and they're just, amoral power acquirers, well, then drive them out would seem to be the only solution. So I don't really think they're antinomies. It depends on who you're actually targeting.
Yeah, as an addendum to what you just said, another thing that's really, really important here is, what do we value, right? So when you brought up the room and you said, well, we'll turn on the lights and we look at all these conveniences and stuff in the room. I mean, whatever vision that's offered radically different to the one we have now, um, we're going to have a conversation about what valuable things the other thing provides that this one doesn't. And I always use the example of this one. Like, people talk about like immigration and GDP all the time. But the question I always ask, and I have like a graduate degree in econ, for crying out loud, the question I always ask is, how does GDP make my life better? Now, you could say, well, there are more goods for you to buy. True, but I don't buy a lot of goods anyway. I'm kind of like a, you know, quasi monk. There's like one video game I'll play for years. I just hang out, talk philosophy with my homies. I don't need a whole bunch of conveniences. If GDP were cut by 25%, I mean, I don't know exactly what my life will be missing. I don't go for the latest fashion clothes. I don't do a lot of stuff, right? Okay, but here's one way in which immigration physically, tangibly alters people's lives. More people immigrating, more people on the road, longer traffic times. People are spending more time in their cars. You can measure that. And you know that, given a preference, people would prefer to spend more time outside their car doing productive stuff than less time in their car driving around. Okay, that's a real tangible thing we can measure. How well do you know your neighbors? That's a very tangible thing that people can physically measure, that GDP doesn't really give you. And so half of this conversation when building a positive movement or anything like that is going to have to be based on, like, what are the current things people are told they should value? What are the people getting out of it or not? And then how do you So what other things would your alternative provide them better, and how do you get people to value that alternative stuff, right? So most people would say, I don't care about know my neighbors. I'm a shut in. I play video games all day, right? I mean, I am a shut in. I play video games all day, but I would prefer to know my neighbors. I'd prefer to have a lot of stuff in walking distance of where I live. I'd like to be able to go out and socialize. It's one of those catch-22s where I, sit in and play video games a lot because society's built in such a way that I can't do much without a car. So it's one of those things, right, where you have to like get people to radically rethink the world and the way they talk about the world in order to even get off the ground talking about what a positive thing might look like. And that's something that I didn't see either side bring up in the conversation too much that I really wish they would have.
Right, right. So I think as a sort of like to wrap all this up for a closing statement, what I would say is that Sargon is right, in the sense that you do have to have a positive message for other people to then assess the cost of leaving the system that we're already in. Now, he doesn't really provide that, not to my satisfaction, and it's difficult for him to justify that given his prior epistemological claims. Academic Agent, I think, is broadly correct when he talks about the nature of power elites and especially how they're functioning in today's society. And I think he's broadly correct that if we're talking about how he would envision interacting with those elites rather than interacting with, say, normies, if you can't reason with them, then drive them out, right? There's a logic to that, and so I think that's the sort. They're both right, but in different contexts. So I guess sort of what I've done is what Plato did with Parmenides and Heraclitus. You're both right, but in different contexts.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with all of that. If it's in my closing statement, if it's some things I really wish would be out of this conversation in the future for clarity, it would be Moore's open question. I think that should just be a given into these conversations every single time because it would solve a lot of these circular problems of falsifiability. I think that the Azot gap is really really important. I think the question of technocracy, the power of technocracy, and how powerful it, Oh, here's a really good way to wrap this up. Sargon was talking to NRX folks, and I never heard the cathedral mentioned one single time in the conversation. Like a lot of our criticism, Todd, is actually wrapped up in the NRX concept of the cathedral. How
Yeah.
much they control the message, how much they filter the message, right? If that would have been the start of this whole thing, okay, Sargon, we want a positive view. Well, the cathedral is going to filter whatever we say through their lens, and that's how normies are going to hear us. A good example of that would be like the trucker protests in Canada. The media focuses on like the 5 people raving like racist signs or something, and not like the thousands of people like doing the trucker protest stuff. As long as they get to filter the message and people believe the filter, it doesn't matter what your positive message is. So the cathedral should be front and center. A discussion about moral foundations and whether or not you have them on the other side doesn't, or vice versa, and what that means for Linsky should be front and center for all these conversations. And if you don't get to these clarifying issues very quickly, you're going to see a conversation that kind of like runs in circles, as Academic Agent and Sargon both complained themselves that the conversation was doing. They were circling some very very big points that if you just put the fine point on them and say this is what we're circling about, let's move on, things go smoother. So
All right. Thank you, Logos. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.